The theme with our previous episodes has been that the heavyweight title, or the history of the heavyweight title rather, can be divided into quite nicely into eras. Mainly around big stars. You've got the John L. Sullivan era, a little bit of uncertainty at the end of that, and then you've got the Jim Jeffries era, Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey was the last one we did, and then Gene Tunney took the title. But each of those champions, the important ones there, were heavyweight champion for a good length of time. As we move into the 1930s, well, end of the 1920s and the 1930s, we're really entering an era where it's sort of a hodgepodge. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of fighters. There's a lot of interweaving stories, and all the stories go a little bit weirdly. So this era is not one where we have one guy and a load of challengers. This is an era where even after guys lose the title, they hang around and they're still important. Max Schmeling, who we're going to be talking about today, loses the heavyweight title, and then what is remembered as his most important fight, or his two most important fights, come after he's already lost the title. So he was getting towards winning the title a second time, which is still a feat that no one's accomplished. I won't tell you who gets there first because that'll ruin that little surprise if you don't already know. But we are getting into an era where this is more a competition rather than Jim Jeffries, John L. Sullivan, one man is invincible and no one can beat them. We do get back to that eventually, but certainly the playing field's a lot more level. Now, obviously Gene Tunney retired after his fight with Tom Heaney. Tom Heaney, not really like the number one contender, just sort of a money fight for Tunney to go out on, and then he married a Connecticut blue blood and an heir to the Carnegie fortune, no less, and lived happily ever after. His son became a senator. Jack Dempsey and him became very good friends. Dempsey never liked admitting that Tunney was a great fighter. He'd always say he was a good fighter, and Tunney caught him on a bad night or something like that. But they did become good friends in later life, and Dempsey helped Tunney's son run for Senate or governor or whatever it was that he eventually got. But Gene Tunney leaves the ring and he abdicates the title, which leaves everyone in a bit of a pickle. If you remember when Jeffries did that, there was a fight between Marvin Hart and Tommy Burns for the heavyweight title, and they said to Jeffries, would that be all right with you? And he was like, I don't care. I'm off to farm alfalfa. And they said, okay, we'll pay you to be the ref. And he was like, okay. Just didn't really lend any authority to the new belt. And as you saw with Jack Johnson, there was always this, he'll come back and win the title. Tunney, there was never as much of that because he did comfortably retire. Money was never an issue for him, and then, there was no big race question to goad him back into the ring. Now, you'll remember before that second Tunney fight, Dempsey was actually in a title eliminator, which was the first non-title fight to garner a $1 million gate. And that was with a lad named Jack Sharkey. And is very famous for the knockout finish being controversial, but that, if you know the story of Jack Sharkey, that is just one of many, many things that made him a very frustrating fighter to watch. William Muldoon, who was head of the New York State Athletic Commission for quite a while, a very important figure in boxing, said that Sharkey was the greatest fighter in the world from the neck down. He had all these mental issues and he just made baffling decisions. But, he was everything that you could want from a fighter. He was 189, 190 pounds roughly for most of his career. He was thickly muscled, but he could move just as well as most of the heavyweights, better than most, in fact. And the other thing was that he had every punch in the book. He was a very smart fighter, didn't rely too much on one punch. He'd hook off the jab beautifully, he'd hit the body wonderfully. His right hand could knock anyone out. He could punch with the best. He punched with Jack Dempsey for however many rounds. When they got in the kitchen, he was happy to just trade with Dempsey. He was executing this game plan at range, but when Dempsey stepped in, and this is another sign of that Jack Sharkey mental aspect, he'd just start throwing back. He was supposed to tie up, and he'd just throw back, and he'd get the better of Dempsey on many occasions. But watching Sharkey's footage is absolutely fascinating because he is one of the best rounded fighters you'll see from this era. As with most boxers at this time, he was not using his birth name. He was born Joseph Zukakis. He was the son of Lithuanian immigrants, and he took up boxing when he was in the Navy. And the story goes that he signed up for this tournament in the Navy, and the sergeant in charge of the sign-up sheet said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Joseph Zukakis." And the guy goes, "You can do better than that." So he took Jack from Jack Dempsey, because he was an enormous Dempsey fan. Dempsey was the champion at the time. And he took Sharkey from sailor Tom Sharkey, partly because he was a sailor, and also Sharkey had a legendary fight with Jim Jeffries. Took all that Jim Jeffries could give him in an era where Jim Jeffries was just decking everyone. But Tom Sharkey was about 5'8", and it built like a block. He had a barrel chest and was just very square. Jack Sharkey was 6 foot even, and just a perfect heavyweight, really. I mean, in that era, nowadays he'd be more like a light heavyweight or a cruiserweight. But just a guy who, in an era of light heavyweights who were fighting up in weight and really looking small, and other heavyweights who were just schlubs, Sharkey was like the space on the Venn diagram between size and skill. If we talk a little bit about Sharkey's style, he was a very tricky and clever boxer. If you watch the Dempsey fight, from the get-go, he wants to uppercut Dempsey's head off, because Dempsey comes in with his head low and his chin completely buried. You'll remember Gene Tunney was talking about that in the last episode. So he starts looking for the right uppercut and the left uppercut every time Dempsey's stepping in. He's throwing out these jabs and trying to mark Dempsey up at range. But within the first round, he connects a lead hand uppercut as Dempsey steps in. Very rare to see that punch done well. Alexis Arguello, that was one of his killers. People don't expect that punch. And he snaps Dempsey's head back, sends him reeling, punches him a few more times along the ropes. And obviously Dempsey is tough as nails, and even if his eyes glaze over, he'll just keep going. But that was round one, and everyone knew then that Jack Sharkey was the real deal. Sharkey's footwork is quite interesting because he has this like bouncing style. If you look at Sharkey's feet when he's moving, he often his rear knee, his right knee, is pointing down, and he's up on the ball of his back foot. And that's something you typically see from guys who want to be able to phase back and immediately hit with the right hand. And he tried that a lot in his fight with Max Schmeling, which we're going to get onto in a minute. That's the stance he uses throughout, and he's trying to fade away and hit the right hand. And then that foot will pivot out on the ball of the foot, and the heel will drop to the floor on the inside when he wants to step in with a dipping jab or something like that. He could hook off the jab really well, which is something that you really don't see from heavyweights in this era. You start seeing it a lot more with Joe Louis, obviously. But, I mean, Tunney didn't do it very well, and he was considered a master boxer for a heavyweight. But Sharkey did it masterfully, and he really confused Phil Scott with that when he went to the UK. He did it a good amount against Tommy Loughran, but Tommy Loughran was fast as lightning and didn't have any of that. And the thing about Sharkey was that he was a very adaptable fighter. And I'm saying adaptable rather than he did adapt very well, because there are fights where he makes baffling decisions, but there are other fights where he demonstrates that he understands a different game plan is necessary, and he executes it perfectly. There are plenty of fighters who can only fight the way they know how to fight. Jack Dempsey is a great example, but you see Sharkey against Primo Carnera later on, who's gigantic, towers over him, he's 6'6", and he uses beautiful level-changing punches to the body, in and out, not relying on his heavy hitting, but setting up the big blows and pecking at Carnera constantly. Then you see him against Jack Dempsey, and he's doing a lot more hitting on the inside. He's using the uppercut more. You see him against Tommy Loughran, and he's really trying to abuse his weight advantage and his power over the light heavyweight champion. And the Loughran fight's actually a fantastic example, because Tommy Loughran, who is going to come up a fair bit in this episode because he features in a lot of guys' stories, but he does never win the heavyweight championship. He is considered one of the greatest light heavyweights of all time. Hundreds of fights on his record, and a beautiful jab. And he has this very long, rangy stance with both knees bent, and it almost looks like Machida-esque. He's got that old school side-on karate style. He was giving Sharkey fits for 2 rounds until Sharkey realised about midway through the second round that because the lead hand was always out there probing and feeling, he could smack it about. So midway through the second round, Sharkey snaps that hand out of the way from the inside and runs in with the right hand to the body, catches him along the ropes. And then as soon as they come out for the third round, he pins that lead hand down with an inside hand trap and rushes in with the right hand to the head, just decks Loughran outright. And that was just a real sharp adjustment in the moment that demonstrated the sort of cerebral fighter that Sharkey could be. However, there is always going to be hanging over his head that Dempsey loss, which, through 7 rounds, Sharkey was battering Dempsey and just completely outclassing him. And then Dempsey starts hitting him low because Dempsey's old school like that. And Sharkey takes another one in the crotch in the 7th round, turns to the referee to say, "You're going to do anything about this?" And Dempsey hits him in the head while he's doing it. And he goes down like he's been shot. And Dempsey said afterwards, "What did he expect me to do? Send him a letter of apology?" And it is fair, the protect yourself at all times thing is very important. And if the guy is fouling you, he's clearly going to take advantage of any moment you give him. So it was very it was a sign of frustration from Sharkey that he did it, and just not having his head in the game as much as he should for a guy of his ability. So that Dempsey fight haunts him a fair amount. But by the Dempsey fight, he was already recognised as one of the best heavyweights in the world, obviously, because it was a title eliminator. Coming from Boston, he wanted to be like the people's fighter, but as a Lithuanian in Boston, often fighting Irish fighters, he was often on the receiving end of boos and jeers, despite wanting to be like the crowd favourite. So he was used to being the guy that people rooted against, and that happened again against Dempsey. But after that fight with Dempsey, he has a draw with Tom Heaney, and then loses a fight to Johnny Risco. But he does this all quite quickly, and within 6 months he started turning it around. He knocks out light heavyweight Jack Delaney, and then he starts racking up these wins. He signs a fight with Tex Rickard against young Stribling, who's another important figure we're going to see a lot of in this episode. And Tex Rickard dies before the fight can be put together. And Sharkey gets very concerned about it, and he says, "Rickard's not even in his grave yet, and he's trying to screw me out of a contract." But he gets the decision over young Stribling. That one's a bit of a controversial one. And then he fights Loughran, knocks him out. Loughran is the light heavyweight champion at the time, and he's stepping up to try and win the heavyweight world title later on. And then Sharkey goes to England and knocks out Phil Scott in 3 rounds. Phil Scott was a respected English heavyweight, but by the end of this fight, he got knocked down a fair few times in it, and the press started calling him Fainting Phil, PH fainting, which is going to haunt you for your whole career. But by this time, Tunney stepped away from the game. This is 1930, and in June 1930, or for June 1930 rather, Sharkey is matched up against a German heavyweight called Max Schmeling for the vacant title. Now, you'll recall from the last episode, Tex Rickard, the wily old promotional genius, worked out how to sell the $1 Million Gate. The first one he did it with was Georges Carpentier versus Jack Dempsey, and then one of the other important ones was Jack Dempsey versus Louis Firpo. Now, those two played on patriotism, nationalism, rooting for your countrymen. And Rickard thought if he found top quality foreign fighters for Dempsey to fight, in fact they didn't even have to be top quality because Firpo certainly wasn't, and Carpentier was significantly undersized to be fighting Dempsey, but Rickard felt like if he got foreign talent he could get the punters in. Problem was he was struggling to find it. So in 1923 he asks Nat Fleischer, who is the founder of Ring Magazine, one of the greats of boxing writing. He asks Nat Fleischer if he's going to Europe in the summer, and Fleischer is. Him and his wife go to Europe by boat, because it's those days, for 8 weeks every year. And some of that is covering various events for newspapers, and the rest of it is just him and his wife going around and vacationing. So he's going to Europe in the summer of 1923, and the paper that he'd been working for had asked him to cover the rise of amateur boxing in Germany. So Fleischer goes along, and he comments on the fact that there seems to be an enormous boom in amateur boxing in Germany, and part of it is because the promoters are giving young boys meal tickets And obviously post-World War I Germany is a hard place to be growing up. Most of you probably know the basic details of World War I and World War II, but part of the reason there was so much unhappiness in Germany during the Weimar Republic, and the reason that Hitler was able to come to power, or at least get the popular vote and become the Chancellor, was that the Treaty of Versailles was pretty harsh. And if you read any of Hitler's speeches or watched them and had the subtitles on, he's always talking about the traitors, the November criminals, this whole stab in the back idea that Germany didn't lose on the battlefield, it was betrayed by its politicians. So Germany is not a happy place at this time. And Fleischer goes there in 1923, 1924, 1925, and I believe it's 1926. And on the last couple of visits, he's being told about this young lad, Max Schmeling, who's going to be the next big thing. And in his final visit, or in the 1926 visit rather, he is able to watch Schmeling fight. Don't think Schmeling wins, but he does say that he had an idea that Schmeling was going to be the future. Schmeling's handlers approach Fleischer and ask him if he'll manage Schmeling, but Fleischer says that he can't. But when he goes back to text Rickard, he tells him all about Max Schmeling. That's one version of the story. The other version of the story is that Jack Dempsey was travelling through Cologne in 1925 and had a sparring session with Schmeling based on the fact that people were telling him how great this young lad was, and the fact that Schmeling is an uncanny lookalike for Dempsey, which is very peculiar, but also could be seen as a selling point in this post-Dempsey age where they're trying to find the next heavyweight star. So after amassing a decent record, Schmeling comes to America and fights at the Garden for the first time in 1928. He's managed by a Jewish American called Yussel Jacobs, or Joe Jacobs. And Jacobs is a legendary manager-promoter. Pissed off a lot of people. There was a fake bomb threat to him based on the fact that he did steal Max Schmeling from Schmeling's previous manager. And Jacobs does a good job of getting booked into a fight with Johnny Risco. Johnny Risco is, you'll remember he beat Sharkey shortly after Dempsey did. That was a hindrance to Sharkey's rebound, and Risco was considered like a spoiler, just someone who was a bit of a journeyman but could make very good fighters look very average. And this fight is in many ways Schmeling's coming out party. He stops Risco in the 9th round, knocking him down in the 1st, 7th, 8th and 9th, all with his right hand, and it's awarded Ring Magazine's 1929 Fight of the Year, which probably would have been awarded by Nat Fletcher, who maybe had an interest in this, but certainly it raises some eyebrows. And while he's a dead ringer for Jack Dempsey in appearance, he's not anything close to the snarling, hungry fighter that Jack Dempsey was in the ring, and what captivated the people, this animal intensity. Schmeling is more of a classical boxer that does a lot of jabbing, but his whole thing is setting up that right hand, and he had a terrific right hand. I mean, every time he dropped Risco with the right hand, most of his knockouts came by right hand, and frankly, if you watch his footage, he barely left hooks at all. So wanting to capitalise on his momentum, Jacobs gets him booked into a match with Paulinho Euskadin, whose name I have only ever seen written down. I can't. I can almost assure you that I'm saying it wrong. But he's a Spanish heavyweight, a rough customer, and one story of this fight says that this is the first time that fight footage has been used in scouting for an important fight. Apparently, it was Jacobs' idea to study the film of Euskadin. It resulted in a very tedious fight that Schmeling took quite handily. Euskadin has this very strange style where he'll cross his hands if he's going to guard himself. Not like a proper cross guard, but with like the gloves there. And he comes in and tries to put his head on Schmeling, and Schmeling puts his head back on Paulinho, and so they're both fighting in like this wrestling crouch from the middle of the ring. Both seem to be missing all their punches, but apparently it was Schmeling's plan to throw jolts to the biceps and forearms and lower Euskadin's guard through the rounds. So he takes a comfortable decision, but it's not a particularly interesting one. And in the course of punching Euskadin's arms and elbows, he badly injures his right hand, which is his Sunday punch. That's in June 1929, and he takes a full year off before he is booked into this title fight against Jack Sharkey in June of 1930. And this is for the vacant title that Gene Tunney has left behind. So the New York State Athletic Commission, the National Boxing Association, and the lineal world heavyweight title are on the line here. And the matchup is a very interesting one because you've got two very different styles. Schmeling uses his head movement a lot more, fights from that crouch leaned off to the side. The more, well, what you'd be more familiar with is an American boxing style, to be honest. And he uses his head movement a lot. He spends a lot of time trying to advance and land the right hand. Meanwhile, Sharkey is a very upright fighter, with fighting on the ball of the back foot, bouncing in and out. If you were asked who was the European and who was the American in that matchup, you'd probably get him the wrong way around. But the fight's going decently, it's warming up. Sharkey's pulling him forward and trying to draw him out for counters, throwing in left hooks to the head and body. And Schmeling has landed some cracking right hands already. And in the fourth round, Schmeling rushes in. Sharkey tries to counter with a left hook to the body and catches him right in the cup. Schmeling goes down screaming, is curled up on the floor in agony, and the referee has no idea what to do. Obviously, no way they're going to watch any kind of replay at this time. He's told by one of the assistant referees at ringside that the shot was low. So eventually, Sharkey is DQ'd. Schmeling is awarded the title on a DQ, which was the first time that's ever happened, and I think that's the only time that's ever happened with a heavyweight title, including all the splintered ones that we've got today. So really controversial and inconclusive way to finish that fight, and it just didn't help the case for one of these men as the next champion. Because it's one thing to not actually win the belt from the champion; it's another thing to not even really win the belt. And this is where it gets all kinds of crazy because Jacobs doesn't want to give Sharkey the immediate rematch, which is contractually required. So the New York State Athletic Commission immediately drops their recognition of Schmeling as their champion. So Schmeling is only the National Boxing Association and lineal heavyweight champion now. And a common theme you'll notice with anyone, once they win the heavyweight title, they don't fight even anywhere near as regularly as they used to. And it's only the heavyweight title, which is why guys like Tommy Loughran, Jack Delaney, all these light heavyweights who've done really well at their class are going up to heavyweight even though they're too small. Because if you win the heavyweight title, that's another level of money and prestige. You fight once a year and it's the biggest event of the year. Whereas guys like Harry Greb are fighting every weekend, and he's considered the best in the world, or was for a very long time at his weight class, but to make ends meet, he had just to fight every weekend. So Schmeling decides to take another whole year off, comes back in July of 1931, and he fights young Stribling. And young Stribling is a guy whose name I'd read a lot, in passing, during my life, but in researching this episode, I actually got to watch some of his fights, very little of it on tape, and I would comfortably put him in the pile now with Kid McCoy, Harry Greb, the guys who I wish there was more footage of, because he is a very smooth customer. He looks too skinny for a heavyweight, very slight, slender guy, but by the time he died, he was only 28 years old. Died in a motorcycle accident on the way to visit his wife, his pregnant wife, expecting the baby in the next few days in hospital. Very tragic way to die, very tragic life story. But he had close to 300 fights. He'd only been beaten a handful of times, and the only time he was ever stopped was this fight against Schmeling. And if you watch the fight, he is just amazingly graceful. His footwork's sharp, his head movement is that sort of head movement where it looks slow and smooth, but he always has an exact sense of timing, and he knows when his opponent's going to punch. It's the kind of look that you only see in fighters who have that 100, 200 fights of experience. But Schmeling's too big, too strong, and just works him over and stops him in the 15th, the last round. And that is another ring fight of the year. It wins the 1931 fight of the year. And when you remember who's fighting in all the other divisions at this time, it's it's pretty impressive that Schmeling now has 2 fights of the year on his record. So finally, in June of 1932, 2 years after the original fight, Sharkey and Schmeling are booked to go again. Sharkey's been keeping himself busy in the meantime. He fought Mickey Walker to a draw, and then he outboxed Primo Carnera, who was on his way up at the time. And the result of the fight was a very controversial victory on split decision for Sharkey. And most of the newspapermen hated this. They felt like Schmeling deserved the victory. And the New York State Athletic Commission, who have just put their title back on this fight, throw a hissy fit and say that they're not going to allow anyone who is not a boxing expert, whatever the fuck that means, to report on any of their matches in future. Just showing that 100 years on, or almost 100 years on, the New York State Athletic Commission is in about the same state. Now, this is the end of Schmeling's title run, but really he becomes more important after his title victory. Actually, it's worth noting before we go on that the Sharkey-Schmeling rematch is responsible for the very famous boxing phrase, well, very famous phrase generally now, "We was robbed," which Joe Jacobs shouted after the match. Now, what makes Schmeling so fascinating as a fighter is that while he does only fight these few times as champion, and he's, inactivity of the heavyweight champion is a fairly commonplace thing, but it's all the stuff behind the scenes that makes Schmeling so interesting. Schmeling starts getting in with a very bohemian group of people in Germany. If you know much about the Weimar Republic, you'll know that there was a big artistic movement during the Weimar Republic, which was then shot down by the rise of the Nazis. Schmeling married Annie Ondra, who was a Czechoslovakian actress, and the interesting thing about Ondra is that Hitler was apparently infatuated with her. She had blonde hair, blue eyes. She was basically the perfect poster child for Nazism. So then you had this couple of the beautiful Aryan actress and the baddest man on the planet, I suppose, at one point, which obviously made for amazing advertisements for Germany and the strength of the Germans for a government that was becoming more and more obsessed with propagating that. Now imagine what they do with Vladimir Klitschko and Hayden Panettiere, because they are a couple of stunners. But the role of Nazi poster boy is an uncomfortable one for Schmeling. When he fights Joe Louis, we'll talk about Joe Louis at length in another episode, I'm sure, because he is another era. That's the era of Louis. But Schmeling is the first man to really show a flaw in Louis. It's been done to death now, but famously, Louis drops his hand after he jabs on the advance. And he comes in quite methodically and slowly at this point. He just double jabs in and waits for a return. And Schmeling realised that he could land his right straight in that moment immediately after the jab. I believe Jack Johnson comes out of the work and points it out in a newspaper article long before the fight, just to prove what a wily old man he was. But Schmeling hits him with something like 40-50 clean right hands on the chin and eventually stops him. And he receives a telegram from Hitler, who is the Führer by this time, saying, "Most cordial felicitations on your splendid victory, Adolf Hitler." And another one from Goebbels, and all sorts of people wishing him well. And most of Max's fighting was done in America, because that was where the big fights took place, and he was a top-ranked heavyweight in the world. So Hitler wanted him to spread the word of Nazism. So apparently what Schmeling did was to just reference the one paragraph on boxing in Mein Kampf over and over again, because Hitler was a big believer in boxing promoting masculinity in Germany's youth. Schmeling would leave off the bit where it goes on to how if more men boxed, they wouldn't have their women stolen by awful Jews and things like that. But he's in this very uncomfortable position where he is the face of Nazi sporting achievement, but he doesn't want to be. In fact, when he loses, following the loss in the rematch to Louis, a much more polished Louis, and faster too. He gets in very quick on Schmeling and does him in 2 minutes. Apparently punctured one of his kidneys. Very brutal beating, that fight. But following the fight, Max Schmeling said that he was almost glad that he lost, because he didn't like how he was being portrayed. Obviously, this is stuff that comes out later. He could well have not thought it at the time, but certainly if you had thoughts about not wanting to be advertised as a great Nazi in Nazi Germany, you'd keep it to yourself. But he never joined the Nazi party, despite the fact that he spent a week with Hitler following the Louis victory. His manager, Joe Jacobs, Yussel Jacobs, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he was Jewish manager, obviously, and the Nazis tolerated that. A great many of his friends in these artistic circles were Jewish, and on Kristallnacht, the night when the brown shirts went around and destroyed a load of Jewish businesses, small businesses, Schmeling helped two young Jewish boys escape and hid them in his hotel room. So while the second Lewis fight, which again we'll talk about at a later date, was like Nazism versus freedom, Schmeling was unwillingly painted into that role. You know, he'd been boxing for years by the time the Nazis came along. He never joined the Nazi party, but that's what he came to represent. Max Baer, when he came to fight Schmeling, famously wore the Star of David on his shorts. But with Schmeling out of the title picture for the moment, Sharky's the champion. Not a very well-liked victory to winning the belt. And almost a year to the day later, it's always June, in June 1933, he matches up with a guy called Primo Carnera. And Primo Carnera is a peculiar story in the fight world. I mean, his size was astounding back then, but it's not that irregular now. He was 6'6". He suffered from pituitary gland issues, which made him grow too big. So he wasn't just a tall guy; he was legitimately gigantic. And he weighed between 250 and 275 pounds throughout his career. Carnera is from a town called Sequels in eastern Italy, and he's the son of a stonecutter. And the average height in these days is like 5'5"-ish. Because nutrition was not what it is, and food was not as readily available to everyone, particularly after the war. But Carnera grows to enormous size anyway. He does various things like touring as a strongman before getting into boxing. And Carnera's career is marked by a number of fake fights that he doesn't... They don't let him in on the fact that they are fake, the guys handling him. He's handled by mobsters, and later when films are made about his life and fake fights are brought in, he attempts to sue the movie studios because he didn't know they were fake, and then loses, which is even sadder given how his career goes. But he fought a lot of soft fights, a lot of soft balls, beats Paulinho Özgedün and the respected black boxer George Godfrey. But Godfrey, that's a foul, basically. Godfrey gets disqualified because Carnera is a pretty dirty fighter. What he does when he's lacking on speed on the inside, he'll stand on guys' feet, he'll give them the elbow, he'll do all sorts of stuff that's just fairly dirty. In 1931, he fights Sharkey for the first time and comes up on the losing end of a unanimous decision. Sharkey just boxes him up and down, drops him in the 4th round. Not without a moment of that patented Jack Sharkey weirdness, though. In the 5th round, Sharkey thinks the fight's been called and tries to step out of the ring, almost getting himself disqualified. Carnera goes on another streak of questionable victories, and eventually he fights Ernie Schaff, who is one of the sort of top 5 heavyweights at the time. The fight is abysmal, and Schaff seems to go down off of a nothing punch. The crowd all think it's a fix, and then Schaff dies in hospital. The result of a blood clot in the brain, supposedly the result of his fight with Max Baer shortly before. But being the unscrupulous sort of people that boxing promoters are, his team begin to sell Primo Carnera as a man-killer. In June 1933, the second fight with Sharkey is booked. Sharkey does his thing wonderfully for 5 rounds, and then in the 6th, steps onto a right hand. The sports writers are very divided upon. By the time you met Sharkey, even the first time, Carnera was getting better as a boxer. He was working with Gus Wilson, who had been George Carpentier's trainer, and had a respectable jab on him. But when Harry Grayson and Joe Williams, 2 sports writers, went to see Carnera training for the first Sharkey fight, Williams insisted that no man who throws a right hand like that could ever be a fighter. And that's what's peculiar about Carnera. He did build up a decent jab over his time as a fighter, but a lot of what he did was just roughhousing in close. Normally when you're dealing with the giant, the problem is the reach, but he was quite happy to be on top of people, treading on their feet. Following the victory over Jack Sharkey, which was heavily rumoured to be a fix, Sharkey had all these mental problems and had thrown big fights like that, like the Dempsey one. But the mobsters behind Carnera now need to make some money. The way they decided to do this was to get Tommy Loughran involved. Tommy Loughran, light heavyweight great. We talked about him once already this episode. We're going to talk about him again because he keeps showing up and beating people. But to give you an idea of how good Loughran was, Jack Dempsey picked him as his main sparring partner for the Tunney fights. And the thinking behind this was to use a great quote from John D. McCullum, Tommy Loughran had two undeniable virtues. His honesty was beyond reproach, and his best days were beyond recall. Which just about sums it up. But through that fight, a lot of people thought that Tommy Loughran did enough to win. When asked about it, Loughran said that he was never hurt, only by Carnera treading on his feet. It was the largest weight discrepancy ever in the heavyweight title fight. McCullum lists it as 105 pounds. I've seen it listed as closer to 90, but Loughran was a very, very small heavyweight, and Carnera was the biggest to ever compete at this point. Problem was that only 8,000 people even bothered to show up for that fight. It seemed like a mismatch of size and strength, and people weren't interested. Plus all the rumours of fight fixing, which was a problem for Primo Carnera's people because they liked money. It's estimated that over the course of his career he earned between $3 and $4 million at the gate, and rarely saw more than $500 per fight in his personal purse. The guy was being manipulated flat out. And you can see that again by the fact that there had been, one heavyweight title fight each year, roughly, over the last few years. And then Tommy Loughran, he fights in March 1934. He's back in the ring in June 1934, just to try and earn some money. And June 1934 is the fight where they decide they need someone legit who's not going to fall over and can't be questioned about falling over. Now, Max Baer's a rancher's son from out in California. He's 6'2", he's handsome, he's strapping. But the most important thing about Baer is that he has this tremendous right hand. Not a terrific boxer all around, but can knock almost anyone out with the right hand. Even more dangerous than Schmelling's. And Schmelling's got decent boxing to put it on. Baer is unpolished. He got boxed up by Tommy Loughran despite a huge size advantage. Suffered a unanimous decision defeat to Ernie Schaff and a couple of others, Johnny Risco, Paulo Özkudun, we'll say that name again. But one of the main selling points about him is that power, and in 1930 he has a very tragic victory over Frankie Campbell. Frankie Campbell knocks him down. Well, thinks he knocks him down. Baer actually slips. Baer rebounds from the floor immediately. Frankie Campbell's walking away to a neutral corner, and Baer cracks him on the chin from behind. Frankie Campbell survives a couple more rounds, but takes a hellacious beating and dies soon afterwards. And this is something that the whole life of Max Baer seems to be affected by. He is famous for being this playboy clown, basically. I can't remember which sports writer it was said it, but they said that he had the soul of a clown, not the soul of a heavyweight champion. And he did. He was like a child. He loved to be loved, and he made a show of everything he did. He was much like Ali in that sense. His training camp, the New York State Athletic Commission actually sent someone out to one of his training camps because they'd been told that he was clowning around and not taking it seriously, and that was before the Carnera fight for the title. But yeah, he's profoundly affected by this Campbell fight. And the worst part is that people are now selling him as a man killer. That's what they sold Jess Willard as, and that's what they sell Primo Carnera as after the Ernie Schaff fight. The Ernie Schaff fight is important because shortly before Ernie Schaff died from injuries in the ring against Carnera, he'd fought Max Baer, and seconds before the fight ended, he's knocked out cold, basically, but saved by the bell. And if you hear any stories about Max Baer's life, it's normally people saying, oh, that's Max Baer, the man killer, and then him getting tremendously upset. He didn't strike anyone as a guy with a love for boxing. He, much like Carnera, was there because he had a natural talent or, natural size and hitting ability. And people, he worked out that was a good way to make money. Carnera, meanwhile, was surrounded by people who were making money off him. Actually, both Baers, Buddy Baer and Max Baer, they're brothers. They both had good runs as heavyweights. Buddy Baer had 2 fights with Joe Louis later on. But Max Baer really comes to the fore with his knockout of Max Schmeling, and that's in 1933. Schmeling, consensus generally is that Schmeling could have won had the fight gone to the scorecards, but he is knocked out in the 10th round. And that is a really rough house fight for Baer. Baer is a clumsy sort of fighter anyway, but he was Jack Dempsey's favourite fighter. The two met after Baer fought Tommy Loughran and lost. Dempsey had been refereeing and then spoke to Max Baer the next morning and talked about stuff he could have done to deal with Loughran. But Maxie became Dempsey's favourite fighter, and Dempsey there's a couple of quotes out there where Dempsey says this guy is the guy to save heavyweight boxing. He goes for the knockout, blah blah blah. But Bear and Dempsey, not very similar in styles, except for that one fight where Bear really roughhouses his man. He's holding the back of the head and pounding away on Schmeling with right hands. He backhands him a couple of times. The knockout comes from, and he throws a lot more left hooks than you see in like the Carnera fight or a couple of his others. But he comes out of the clinch with a crossface, and as Schmeling's moving away, he cracks him with the overhand, sends him down for the count. Brilliant stuff. And that's what lines him up for the match with Carnera. And the match with Carnera is, it's the worst or best fight depending on who you ask. It's much like the Dempsey-Firpo one, but Carnera gets sent down 11 or 12 times, but is jabbing Bear up quite comfortably in moments on the when they're standing at range. Bear backhands him as well, so there's a good amount of roughhousing. They wrestle to the floor several times. Famous quote, Bear says, "Last one up's a sissy," every time they hit the floor. Bear's doing pirouettes and showing off for the crowd. And, if you watched Cinderella Man, the film, I think it's Ron Howard, but he's really portrayed badly in that film as like a mean guy, when really he was just a guy who loved being loved, adored the spotlight. In one of the early falls, where Bear hits Carnera holds but falls, and then Bear falls on top of him, he sprains Carnera's ankle. So Carnera is also boxing on one foot for the rest of the fight. It's the ugliest fight you'll ever watch. I can only say that you should watch it in its entirety. But Bear comes away with the knockout in the 11th round. And it's a nice thing for Carnera because it's when the fight press, they're never going to stop questioning his boxing ability, and they know that he had a lot of fixed fights. There's commissions have stripped people of their purses for fights with Carnera. But they do stop questioning his heart. He takes a terrific pounding in that fight. And the other interesting thing about that fight is that he's fighting... Bear's a tall guy. He's 6'2", 6'3", and his main thing is his looping overhand right. And Carnera is too tall for most guys to get with that. Jack Sharkey would have had a lot of trouble swinging up at him. Caught him with left hooks mainly. Very rarely caught him with the overhand or right hand to the head. But in the course of training for that fight, Carnera's handlers were trying to teach him to not lean away from the punch and actually move in and duck down under it. And if you are a 6'6" guy who's never had to duck a punch in his life, it's going to be hard to adapt to that. And the very first overhand right that comes stuns him badly, and he's just not with it for the rest of the fight. Max Baer goes some way to reinvigorating interest in boxing through the heavyweight division at least, through the early 1930s. After he fights Carnera, he knocks out King Levinsky in 2 rounds, and then in 1935 he takes on James Braddock. Now, Jim Braddock was the definition of a hard times man. You see a lot of these in boxing, like Charlie Burley, Jersey Joe Walcott, my favourite fighter of all time. Guys who their record doesn't really reflect their ability because they're having to work 1 or 2 extra jobs, guys for whom boxing is just another thing on the list to make ends meet rather than their profession. James Braddock was a very talented amateur. He was the schoolboy champion of New Jersey or something like that in 1925 and 1926. He trained under Joe Jeanette, the very famous black heavyweight who fought Jack Johnson something like 11 times. Go watch the Jack Johnson episode. I think I put some footage of old Johnson sparring with old Jeanette in that. They're like 60 and still moving quite well. But Joe Jeanette was a classy fighter. The story goes that a fight manager named Joe Gold was trying to convince some guys on his new prospect, and he brought him into the gym to work out, picked Braddock out of just the guys who were working out there and said, "Do you want to come spar with my guy for a couple of rounds?" And apparently he did so well that the buyers were no longer interested in the prospect that Gold was showing them, and Gold said, "Okay, well, now you're going to work for me instead." Braddock, very promising professional career as a light heavyweight, earned himself a fight with Tommy Loughran for the New York State Athletic Commission light heavyweight title. This was a couple of months before Tommy Loughran gave up the light heavyweight title to pursue his heavyweight career. And if you watch that fight, Loughran just styles all over him. It's absolutely beautiful. He's feinting him out. He's pivoting offline beautifully. Braddock's got a good right hand, but he just can't get anywhere close with it. Every time they get in close, Loughran's left forearm will be down the side of his neck and cross-facing him off, and Loughran will be stepping offline. Really impressive performance from Tommy Loughran, one of the best ones we got on film. It's probably only one of 3 or 4 fights that you can find of Jim Braddock on film. But it's a younger Braddock, a happier Braddock, and by the end of the fight, it was a very unhappy Braddock. That was the fight in which his hand trouble started. Braddock broke his right hand, and this was going to be a recurring injury throughout his career. And it was not just going to affect his in-ring career; it was going to affect his out-of-ring career. Because after the crash of 1929, Braddock became a day labourer. He was working as a longshoreman on the docks. He'd be heaving coal and steel for 10 hours a day, and that was only if he got the work. Other days he'd be going from business to see if they wanted any help. Ended up on social welfare because he was broke, and he does keep fighting during this time. He doesn't just give up fighting. It is exactly like Joe Walcott's. There are weird gaps in his record, and then he'll get a fight, and then he'll lose to guys who are just nowhere near the level of Tommy Loughran, obviously. This episode is becoming a love letter to Tommy Loughran, but when he meets Tommy Loughran, his official record is 35-5. That fight happens in 1929. By June 1933, he's 44-25. So just checkered record, the definition of it. In fact, a lot of losses and not too many wins for the few years in the interim. And again, that's that thing with Charlie Burley, Joe Walcott. You're going from shift work or manual labour to a fight in the evening, and maybe you won't have eaten. So things are getting absolutely desperate, and his manager, Joe Gold, who is either a genius or a terrible manager, depending on who you read. Some authors say that he's a genius because of what he does later with well, I'll tell you in a minute, but others say that he was just a terrible manager because why would you let your fighter get into this state when he clearly has such ability? But Gold begs to be on the Madison Square Garden card for Carnera versus Bear. One of Carnera's sparring partners, a guy named Corn Griffin, who impressed a lot of the press during the open workouts because he could handle Carnera so well in the sparring. So Braddock actually gets onto the card, but he takes the fight on 2 days' notice. It's scheduled for 5 rounds. It's not a full-length professional bout, but Braddock's sent down early, gets up, immediately knocks down Griffin, knocks him down again, and scores the knockout in the 3rd round, upsetting the plans for Corn Griffin and his team. So from then on, Braddock becomes a feature at the Garden, and obviously the Garden is a fairly big arena. And what is it Sugar Ray Robinson used to say? He used to say that the real boxing fans are out the back, up in the back seats, because they're the ones who pay the bottom prices to try and come more. But Braddock's story resonates with people, especially, boxing is the sport of the poor man, and his story caught on, and eventually, with a couple of good wins under his belt, and the money to actually feed his family properly so that he can take time to box, he gets matched with a guy called Art Lasky. And Art Lasky was knocking out everyone. They were lining him up to be Max Baer's next opponent when Braddock meets him in March of 1935. And Braddock boxes his ears off. So the next logical step is to put Braddock, the Cinderella Man, in with Max Baer. And that happens in June of 1935. And Braddock puts on a masterclass. He jabs beautifully. He steps away from Baer's right hand constantly, and there's just large periods in the fight where he'll step to the right, Baer will adjust, and as he adjusts, the jab will go into his face. And it happens time and time again, and Baer can't get the timing down, and is really struggling with it. And Baer, his right hand's always hanging by his side because he's ready to swing it in this big overhand motion. But when the jabs start coming in, he has to start picking it up and putting it in front of his face to palm the jabs. So it's very obvious whenever he wants to throw his right hand, and anytime he does, Braddock just throws the left hand in his face. And anytime the right hand does come, Braddock will either roll it off or take it, and then he'll immediately return with a right hand and a left. So you get this fight where maybe Bear is landing his punches, but every time he does, Braddock will land 2 more in the aftermath of the swing, and in between each swing, Braddock's landing heaps of jabs, and Braddock's hooking off the jab. And Braddock's, he's not an amazing boxer for his day. He's not probably not as skilled as Sharkey, definitely not as skilled as Loughran, but he is tough enough to hang with Max Baer, and he's sharp enough to exploit Max Baer's flaws. And Max Baer, in this fight, the clowning really comes to kick him in the arse. Every time he gets hit with a jab, he poses indignantly. And that's, it reminds me of the Anderson Silva, Chris Weidman stuff, and that whole, he could have won if he wasn't fooling around. And a lot of that stuff is a guy's response to not being able to deal with something. If you're eating jabs, if someone's circling out from you and you can't catch up with them, you accuse them of being a sissy, hoping that they'll stop. It's something where you're not actually going to be able to stop them, but maybe you can trick them into stopping. And it's the same thing with posing indignantly when you get jabbed in the face, or trying to play stuff off like you were in complete control the whole time, but you're not. So Baer is clearly losing his temper, and he throws Braddock at one point, and the ref breaks him and says, "Don't you do that?" And he does like a doffing of his hat to the crowd on both sides of the ring, and it's very clear that he's more concerned in keeping up appearances than he is with actually dealing with this fighter who's in front of him, or dealing with the stuff that the fighter's bringing. And really, just the whole fight is an implosion of Max Baer's character. He never learned to jab as well as he should for a heavyweight champion. He never really learned to not just rely on his right hand. And when he was in with someone who could deal with the roughhouse tactics and was jabbing him up at range and could take his punches and return with their own and could hit decently too, he just really struggled and melted down basically in the ring. Baer, coming into the fight, he said that Braddock had just been signed his death warrant and he could knock him out whenever he wants. At one point, reportedly, Braddock even says to him, "Hey Max, you better get going, you're way behind." And Max does pour it on in the 15th round, but it's too little too late, and Braddock takes the title. Now, Braddock's story has a fairly happy ending. We'll get into the stuff when we go into Joe Louis, but this is where Joe Gold does show himself to be a clever enough guy. Max Schmeling is lined up for a title shot, and Mike Jacobs, who is the manager of Joe Louis, he's whipped up the anti-Nazi League in America and tried to make people declare that they'll boycott the fight if the fight is given to Schmeling rather than his fighter Louis. But Gold and Braddock managed to negotiate a deal whereby they get 10% of... should Louis win, they get 10% of Mike Jacobs' earnings on Joe Louis for the rest of his career, which is not as much as the 10% on Joe Louis's earnings that some people report this as, but it's still a good amount over one of the most successful heavyweight careers ever. Does raise all kinds of questions about the ethics of that, though. You would think that if that happened in the modern era, there'd be someone stepping in, because that seems like betting against yourself almost. But Braddock earns $300,000 for that fight, and loses, but continues to earn on Louis's career. So that's the sort of muddled era from the end of the 1920s to the middle of the 1930s. And it's, the Great Depression happens through it, and there is a feel-good story with Braddock at the end there. Braddock gets out of the game with his faculties intact and a good amount of money. Max Baer does all right. He suffers a few more nasty knockouts against Joe Louis and Lou Nova, but he is retired by the time he's 30-ish, so he's quite happy. And his son went on to play a major role in the Beverly Hillbillies, a show I've never seen. Max Schmeling's is probably the happiest ending, because after he retires from boxing, he does end up penniless for a while. Eventually he invests in a Coca-Cola franchise, owns a little shop, and after the war, because he's such a popular figure, the Coca-Cola Corporation decide to make him their head of operations in Germany, or some similar title. So he died at the age of 99, happy, never divorced Annie Ondra. Never divorced Annie Ondra, even though she died 30, 40 years before him. And paid for Joe Louis's funeral when Joe Louis was stone broke at the end of his career and died. They became good friends after that. Not after his funeral, after their fight. So that's the happy one. And then the heart-wrenching one is Primo Carnera, because he ended up penniless. His left leg was paralyzed by the time he ended his career. He was dragging it around in the ring for his last few fights. The mobsters that ran his career basically took off, and he was left in a position where he was fighting real fights against, guys who weren't going to fall down. And he was past what would have been his athletic best anyway. Paul Gallico, the famous sports writer, mainly famous for getting knocked about by Jack Dempsey when he was they were going to cut him from the paper, and he said, "Oh no, I'll box Jack Dempsey," because he was an avid boxer. And Dempsey didn't have like a gentle spar at any point in his life. He just battered this guy. But when Gallico was leaving, at the age of 40, he decided that he wasn't going to cover sports anymore. That was a young man's game, and he was going to work on being a novelist. He succeeded, but he wrote a book called Farewell to Sport, and he had a load of essays in that, and one of them was Pity the Poor Giant, which was specifically about Primo Carnera and all the fixed fights, just the way that people exploited him. Primo got diabetes when he was older too, so he was penniless and diabetic, but a wrestling promoter did finally pick him up and actually gave him a fair portion for his appearances, and he actually earned a good amount of money back by the end of his life. But he did die at like 60, so not a very long life, and probably not a very happy one. Though it was a preview of what would happen with Andre the Giant, the popularity of taking the Giant from town to town. So a very strange time for the heavyweight crown. One of very little stability, very few defenses, very few fights generally. Guys were fighting every other month when they were building up their resumes to challenge for the crown, and then they just disappear. So coming into the age of Joe Louis, we start to get an era of stability. We get one of the best technical heavyweights of all time. So the technical portion of when we cover that will be good fun. But things finally settle down, and boxing gains popularity as a result. People like consistency, and this is true of every combat sport. The UFC is struggling with this too. If there's not a guy who's consistently winning, if everything's up in the air all the time, and the champion's changing every couple of months, or every couple of fights rather, people don't get invested in the same way. You need the John L. Sullivan, the Jim Jeffries, even Jack Johnson. If you're a villain and you keep winning, it's still something that people can be invested in. So that brings us to the end of our sort of whistle-stop tour of the 20s and 30s. Thanks to all you Patreon supporters for supporting the podcast and my efforts in this new medium. It's not even new anymore. We're coming up on a year, basically, since we started this. I think for the next episode, I want to do something on MMA history before we move on with the heavyweight title stuff. I've got a really interesting idea. I'll see if you guys like it, but it's one of my favourite fighters of all time. If you followed my work for a while, he's the guy who got me into MMA all those years ago. And his story is fascinating. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and cheers for your support.